The vastness of the Russian Empire in the 19th century was more than a geographical fact. It was a state of mind. Beyond the glittering ballrooms of St. Petersburg and the bustling merchant quarters of Moscow lay an endless expanse of forest and steppe, a world apart governed by ancient rhythms and older fears. It was in these remote, isolated villages that the soul of old Russia persisted, a complex tapestry woven from threads of orthodox faith, deep-seated superstitions, and a pervasive sense of mystical connection to the land. Here, the line between the divine and the demonic was often blurred, and the search for spiritual truth could lead down paths far darker than the Holy Synod and the capital could ever conceive. Our story unfolds in one such remote village, a cluster of wooden izbas nestled against the impenetrable wall of the northern forest, somewhere in the provinces of Yaroslav or Kostroma. Life here was a relentless cycle of toil, dictated by the short growing season and the long, crushing darkness of winter. The peasantry, only recently emancipated from serfdom in 1861, lived in a state of profound poverty and spiritual hunger. The official church, represented by an often distant and overworked priest, offered solace to some. But for others, its rituals felt empty, its hierarchy disconnected from the raw, immediate need for a faith that addressed their suffering directly. It was from this fertile ground of discontent and yearning that the figure of Mikhail emerged. Historical records, primarily from sensationalist newspaper reports and Tsarist police archives, are frustratingly sparse on his origins. He was a peasant, like any other. Perhaps his full name was Mikhail Ivanov or Mikhail Petrov, a common name lost to the commonality of his station. But something set him apart. He was likely literate, a rare feat for a peasant, which would have granted him an aura of immense authority. He may have been a former soldier, exposed to new ideas during his service, or perhaps he was simply a man of intense, unshakable charisma, whose eyes burned with a conviction that captivated the desperate and the disillusioned. Sometime in the 1870s or the 1880s, Mikhail began to preach. He started subtly, holding gatherings in his own izba or in secluded clearings in the forest. His teachings were a heretical blend of radical Christian mysticism and pre-Christian pagan beliefs that had never been fully eradicated from the peasant consciousness. He spoke of the official Orthodox Church as the whore of Babylon, a corrupt institution that had lost its way. He proclaimed the imminent end of the world, a fiery apocalypse that would cleanse the earth of the wicked, the landlords, the priests, the Tsar himself. But salvation was possible. Mikhail preached that he alone held the key to redemption. He was a new prophet, a messiah for the poor and the oppressed. His followers, drawn from the poorest and most disaffected villagers, began to see him not just as a teacher, but as a living vessel of divine power. They separated themselves from the community, forming a closed, secretive sect. They likely called themselves something innocuous, perhaps the Seekers of Truth or the Pure in Heart, but their beliefs were anything but benign. At the core of Mikhail's doctrine was a terrifying inversion of Christian sacrament. He taught that to achieve purity and to ward off impending doom, one had to make the ultimate sacrifice. It began with animals. Rituals were held deep in the forest, away from prying eyes. A sheep or a goat would be brought before the congregation. Mikhail would lead incantations, speaking in tongues, calling upon powers both celestial and chthonic. The animal would then be slaughtered, not for food, but in a specific ritualistic manner. Its blood carefully collected, its body offered as propitiation to the angry god Mikhail preached about.
These rituals served a powerful psychological purpose. They bonded the sect members together through a shared, terrifying secret. The spilling of blood became a symbol of their severance from the old world and their commitment to the new terrible truth revealed by their leader. Mikhail's authority became absolute. He demanded not just belief, but complete obedience. He controlled their food, their property, and their lives. Women were likely told to submit to him as a divine right. The sect became a state within a state, a cancerous growth on the body of the village, its true nature hidden behind a facade of peasant normalcy. For years, the sect operated in the deepest secrecy. The village starosta, elder, and the local priest may have heard whispers, strange sounds from the forest at night, the peculiar absence of certain families from church services, the fanatical gleam in the eyes of Mikhail's followers. But in the context of rural Russia, where strange sects like the Skoptsi, castrators, and the Khlisti, flagellants, were known to exist, it was easier to look away. To investigate was to invite trouble, to bring the unwelcome attention of the Tsar's officials down upon the entire village. The silence of the community was purchased with fear, fear of Mikhail and fear of the authorities. This isolation allowed Mikhail's doctrine to fester and evolve. The animal sacrifices, it seemed, were no longer enough to satisfy his god or his growing messianic delusion. The whispers of apocalypse grew louder in his sermons. The need for a greater, more potent sacrifice began to permeate his teachings. The logic was horrific and inevitable. If an animal's blood could bring temporary grace, what power might a human sacrifice hold? The ultimate offering to secure their place in the new kingdom to come. The first human victim was likely a member of the sect itself. Perhaps it was a doubter, someone who questioned Mikhail's divinity and needed to be silenced. Or perhaps it was a willing fanatic, convinced that their martyrdom would be the key that unlocked heaven's gate. The police reports would later speak of missing persons, but in an era where peasants often left to find work in cities and never returned, a disappearance was not immediately alarming. The ritual would have been an amplified version of the animal sacrifices, held on a moonless night in the most remote part of the forest, accompanied by chanting and ecstatic dancing. The blood, now human, was collected as the most sacred of relics. The Rubicon had been crossed. The secret that bound the sect was now sealed in blood. Mikhail's power was complete, but the outside world, with its efficient, bureaucratic machinery of state, was slowly beginning to turn its gaze toward the dark of the forest. The history of Russia is filled with shadows, with stories whispered in the long winter nights that are stranger and darker than any fiction. If you are drawn to the mysteries that lie buried in the forgotten corners of the past, then you need to follow this descent into terror. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. The investigation is about to begin, and the truth is more horrifying than any rumor. The insular world of Mikhail's sect could not hold its terrible secret forever. A crime of such magnitude creates ripples, no matter how remote the pond. The first cracks in their armor of secrecy likely appeared through the most human of failings: guilt, fear, or a simple mistake. Perhaps a sect member, traumatized by what they had witnessed and participated in, confessed to a relative in a moment of weakness, swearing them to secrecy. The relative, burdened with horrific knowledge, may have eventually broken and gone to the village priest. Or perhaps a child, too young to fully understand the need for silence, spoke of blood rituals in the woods to a playmate from outside the sect. In a small village, such whispers were currency, passed quickly from house to house, each time growing more detailed and more alarming. Another possibility is that the disappearance of a villager was finally deemed too suspicious to ignore. If the victim was someone with ties to the outside community, a person who regularly traded in a nearby town or had family in another village, their absence would eventually prompt questions. The local starosta, responsible for order, would have been compelled to investigate. Confronted with the wall of silence and fanatical loyalty that surrounded Mikhail, he would have had no choice but to escalate the matter to the district authorities. Sometime in the late 1880s, the machinery of the Tsarist state began to grind into motion. A report landed on the desk of a police official in the provincial capital. It would have been couched in cautious language, troubling rumors of fanatical religious gatherings, concerns over missing persons, a peasant named Mikhail suspected of leading a deviant sect. To the authorities, this was a familial problem. The Russian Empire was perpetually anxious about religious schismatics, Raskolniki, and sectarians, viewing them not just as heretics, but as potential revolutionaries who undermined the sacred unity of Tsar, God, and motherland. An investigation was ordered. The first gendarmes to arrive in the village would have been met with a wall of silence. The uninitiated villagers, fearful of both the sect and the police, would have claimed to know nothing. Mikhail's followers, drilled in secrecy and bound by blood oaths, would have denied everything. The initial investigation likely yielded nothing but frustration. The police had rumors, but no bodies, no witnesses, and no evidence.
The breakthrough would have come from within. The immense psychological pressure of harboring such a ghastly secret began to tear the sect apart. While Mikhail's inner circle remained fanatically loyal, those on the periphery, perhaps newer initiates who had not yet been exposed to the full horror, began to crack. The threat of eternal damnation for their sins may have become less potent than the very immediate fear of the hangman's noose. One or more individuals seeking to save their own souls or their own lives broke ranks. In a secret meeting with the police, perhaps in the dead of night, a terrified follower provided a statement. They gave details, locations in the forest, descriptions of the rituals, the names of participants, and the grimmest detail of all, the human sacrifices. They may have led the gendarmes to a shallow, hidden grave. With this evidence in hand, the police moved quickly. The arrest warrant was signed. A contingent of armed gendarmes, perhaps accompanied by Cossacks for added force, descended on the village and surrounded Mikhail's izba. The arrest was likely swift and violent. Mikhail was taken into custody along with his most devoted followers. Their homes were searched, and it was during these searches that the police found the physical evidence that would shock the empire. Ritual paraphernalia, knives stained with blood that was not animal in origin, and perhaps even preserved human remains. The suspects were transported in chains to the nearest city with a proper prison, perhaps Yaroslavl or Kostroma. They were thrown into cold, damp cells to await interrogation. The Tsarist police were not known for their gentle methods. The process would have been brutal, designed to break the will of the accused and extract full confessions. Faced with overwhelming pressure and the testimony of their former comrades, the followers began to talk. They confirmed the worst fears of the investigators. The story they told was a coherent narrative of horror. They spoke of Mikhail's magnetic personality, his apocalyptic sermons, and the gradual escalation from animal to human sacrifice. They named victims. Some were outsiders, travelers or peasants from neighboring villages who had been lured to their doom. Others were their own, deemed insufficiently pure, or offered as the ultimate proof of devotion. The confessions described rituals of terrifying barbarity, carried out in a state of collective hysteria whipped up by their leader. The judicial process that followed was a spectacle. The case was too sensational to be handled quietly. It became the subject of intense interest from the central government. The Ministry of the Interior, ever wary of popular unrest and religious fervor, would have monitored it closely. The accused were tried in a closed military court, a common practice for cases deemed to threaten state security. The atmosphere was one of grim inevitability. Mikhail, throughout the proceedings, likely remained defiant.
he would have seen himself not as a criminal, but as a martyr for his faith. He might have preached to the judges, warning them of the hellfire that awaited them for persecuting a prophet. His fanaticism on field display in the courtroom only served to cement his guilt in the eyes of the state. The verdict was never in doubt. Mikhail and the inner circle of his sect were found guilty of multiple counts of murder, sacrilege, and belonging to a banned religious sect. The sentence was death by hanging, but lesser participants received sentences of hard labor in the silver mines of Siberia, katorga, a fate often considered worse than a quick death. The executions were carried out in a public square, a warning to any who would dare to challenge the theological and social order of the Russian Empire. Mikhail went to his death without showing fear, perhaps still proclaiming his divinity until the trapdoor opened beneath his feet. With the crack of the rope, the physical life of the peasant messiah was over, but the story was far from finished.
The trial and execution of Mikhail and his followers were not the end of the affair. They were merely the end of its first bloody act. The shockwaves from the remote village reverberated through the layers of Russian society, from the peasant huts of the provinces to the gilded halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The case became a national sensation, primarily through the medium of the popular press. Newspapers like Moskovsky Vedomosti, Moscow News, and Novoye Vremya, New Time, pounced on the story. Their reports were a mixture of factual court reporting and lurid sensationalist speculation. Mikhail was dubbed the Forest Devil, the Peasant Antichrist, and the Butcher of Province Name. The articles played upon the deepest fears of the urban readership, the primitive, superstitious, and potentially savage nature of the peasant masses, from whom they were so profoundly disconnected. The story confirmed every bourgeois anxiety about the dark people, or Temyara Narod, who populated the vast countryside. The government of Tsar Alexander III viewed the incident with grave concern, but for different reasons. The year was likely the late 1880s, a period of intense reaction and political repression following the assassination of his father, Alexander II, in 1881. The state was obsessed with order, orthodoxy, and the ruthless suppression of any dissent, be it political or religious. The Mikhail case was not just a murder story. It was a symptom of a disease the state feared was spreading: religious schism, or raskol, and sectarianism. The official response was twofold. First, it was a cover-up. The full, gruesome details of the case were suppressed. The Ministry of the Interior would have issued circulars instructing newspapers to tone down their reporting and avoid specifics that could inspire copycats or further unrest. The state's narrative was carefully crafted. This was not the result of deep-seated social problems or spiritual emptiness. It was the work of a single monstrously deviant individual and his crazed followers. It was an anomaly, a bizarre outlier, not a sign of systemic failure. Second, it was a catalyst for increased persecution. The case provided the perfect pretext for a renewed crackdown on all non-Orthodox religious groups. Old believer communities, Molokans, Doukhobors, and other sects found themselves under increased police surveillance. Their meetings were broken up, their leaders arrested on trumped-up charges, and their members harassed. The state doubled down on its policy of forced Russification and religious orthodoxy, using the horrific actions of one sect to tar all religious dissenters with the same brush. Within the Russian Orthodox Church, the case sparked a complex debate. For the conservative hierarchy, it was a vindication of their hardline stance against any deviation from church doctrine. They pointed to Mikhail as the inevitable endpoint of individual interpretation of Scripture and mystical fervor. However, for a smaller, more reform-minded faction within the church, the case was a tragedy that highlighted their own failings. They asked uncomfortable questions.
Why were these peasants so spiritually adrift? Why didn't the official church fail to provide them with the solace and guidance they needed? The case was a stark indictment of the church's neglect of its rural flock. For the intelligentsia, the writers, philosophers, and radicals of the era, the story of Mikhail became a potent symbol. Conservatives used it to argue that the Russian peasant was not yet ready for freedom or self-government, that he was still a primitive creature requiring the firm hand of the Tsar in the church. Liberals and radicals, on the other hand, saw it as a damning consequence of the oppression, poverty, and ignorance in which the peasantry was kept. To them, Mikhail was not a monster, but a product of a monstrous system. His actions were a distorted, insane reflection of the violence and brutality inherent in Tsarist autocracy itself. The most enduring cultural impact, however, was on the popular imagination. The story of Mikhail entered the realm of folklore. In the villages of northern Russia, the tale was told and retold, evolving with each telling. Mikhail became a supernatural figure, a sorcerer who had made a pact with the devil. The secluded forest where the rituals took place became a haunted place to be avoided after dark. Parents warned their children to behave, or the forest devil would get them. The real-life horror of the event was metabolized into a folk myth, a cautionary tale about the dangers of straying from the community and dabbling in the dark arts.
Yet the mystery was never fully solved. The police investigation, focused on securing convictions, had left many questions unanswered. How many people had truly been killed? Were the victims all willing participants, or were there more innocent travelers who had vanished without a trace? Had Mikhail acted alone in his revelations, or had he been influenced by even older, more secretive folk traditions? The official file was closed, but the shadows at its edges remained deep and impenetrable. The story of Mikhail is a window into the soul of a nation at a crossroads, torn between ancient beliefs and a modernizing world. If you are fascinated by the hidden history that shapes our present, by the stories too dark for textbooks, then you need to delve deeper. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for notifications. We are just beginning to unravel the secrets of the past. To understand the tragedy of Mikhail's sect, one must venture beyond the police reports and newspaper headlines and into the murky depths of psychology, sociology, and the unique spiritual landscape of 19th century Russian peasantry. What drove a man to commit such atrocities, and what compelled dozens of others to follow him into the abyss? Mikhail was almost certainly a complex figure, not a simple monster. Modern psychological analysis would likely point to a combination of factors. He may have suffered from a severe personality disorder, such as narcissistic personality disorder or schizophrenia, manifested in his grandiose delusions of being a divine prophet. His charisma was not necessarily a sign of health. It is a common trait in individuals with narcissistic and antisocial tendencies, allowing them to manipulate and dominate others with terrifying effectiveness. His doctrine did not emerge from a vacuum. It was a pathological reflection of the world in which he lived. The pervasive poverty, the constant hunger, and the sheer hardship of peasant life created a baseline of suffering that made apocalyptic thinking plausible. When your present life is a living hell, the promise of its imminent end and replacement with a divine kingdom is powerfully attractive. Mikhail's preaching offered a framework to make sense of this suffering. It was not meaningless. It was a test, a prelude to a glorious future for which they must prepare through extreme purification. The sociological structure of the sect is classic of destructive cults. Mikhail employed well-documented techniques of control. Isolation. He physically and psychologically separated his followers from their families and the wider community, creating an us versus them mentality. Control of information. As a literate man, he controlled the narrative.
He interpreted reality for them, defining good and evil, truth and falsehood. Demand for purity. He established ever-increasing standards of purity that were impossible to maintain, ensuring his followers were perpetually in a state of guilt and dependence on him for absolution. Gradual escalation. He began with small demands, attending secret meetings, then moved to larger ones, donating property, animal sacrifice, before culminating in the ultimate demand, human life. This process, known as the foot-in-the-door technique, breaks down resistance incrementally. The followers were not merely helpless victims, they were active participants, drawn from a pool of people who were deeply vulnerable. They were the poorest of the poor, the socially ostracized, the spiritually desperate. They were seeking certainty, community, and purpose in a world that offered them none. Within the sect, they found a powerful sense of belonging and elite status. They were the chosen ones, privy to a secret truth that would save them while the rest of the world perished. This potent combination of fear, of the apocalypse, and reward, salvation, is a recipe for fanatical loyalty. The rituals themselves served a crucial function. The animal sacrifices were a form of traumatic bonding, a shared experience of violence that intensified group cohesion. Spilling blood together created a powerful, unbreakable secret. By the time Mikhail introduced human sacrifice, his followers were so deeply enmeshed in the belief system and so traumatized by their previous actions that they were psychologically incapable of turning back. To reject the ritual would be to reject the entire meaning system that gave their lives purpose, and to face the terrifying prospect of having committed atrocities for nothing. The role of pre-Christian pagan beliefs cannot be overstated. Russian folk tradition was, and in some ways still is, a thick layer under the surface of orthodoxy. Belief in forest spirits, lishi, water nymphs, rusalki, and the primal power of blood sacrifice was never fully eradicated. Mikhail's genius, however twisted, was in synthesizing these ancient dark traditions with Christian apocalypticism. He created a new, potent heresy that spoke directly to the deepest, oldest layers of the peasant consciousness.
The Tsar state's response, while brutal, was also a failure of understanding. They saw only criminality and heresy, not the underlying social despair that made such a movement possible. Their solution, the hangman's noose and the Siberian mine, addressed the symptom but not the disease. The poverty, the ignorance, the spiritual neglect of the countryside continued unabated, creating conditions where another Mikhail could potentially rise again. The legacy of Mikhail is a haunting reminder of the human capacity for evil in the name of good. It shows how easily spiritual yearning can be perverted into fanaticism, how charisma can be weaponized, and how isolation can make ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities. It is a case study in the banality of evil, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the rustic, peasant sense. The horror that can fester in a remote wooden hut fueled by poverty, faith, and the desperate human need to matter in a vast and uncaring universe. The official story of Mikhail ends with the snap of a rope in a provincial town square, but for the historian and the true crime enthusiast, the case remains tantalizingly open, shrouded in the mists of time and bureaucratic obfuscation. The Tsarist police had their convictions. They had quelled a public menace and delivered a lesson in state power. But they had little interest in the deeper, more uncomfortable questions that the case raised. The greatest mystery is the scale of the atrocities. The police investigation was focused on securing enough evidence to hang Mikhail and his lieutenants. How thorough was their search of the vast forests surrounding the village? How many shallow, unmarked graves might have escaped their notice? The confessions spoke of multiple victims, but were these all that there were? Given the sect's existence over several years, it is terrifying to consider the possibility that the number of murders was higher than the official count.
Were there travelers, pilgrims, or itinerant workers who vanished without a trace, their disappearance never connected to the fanatics in the forest? The origins of Mikhail's doctrine remain obscure. Was he a true isolated visionary, the man who constructed his horrific theology entirely from his own warped interpretation of the Bible and his environment? Or was he influenced by contact with other, even more secretive sects? Russia had a long history of extreme religious groups. The Sculpci, who practiced castration to achieve angelic purity, and the Klisti, who sought salvation through ecstatic dancing and self-flagellation, were known to have underground networks. Could Mikhail have encountered their teachings and taken their principles of bodily purification to a new, even more extreme conclusion? His rituals suggest a familiarity with archaic, shamanistic traditions that predated Christianity in the region. Was he tapping into a vein of knowledge that had been passed down in secret for generations? The fate of the sect's children is another dark area of speculation. Were they merely witnesses to the horrors, traumatized spectators, or were they forced to participate? In the extreme logic of doomsday cults, children are often seen as the purest vessels, and the sacrifice of a child is considered the most powerful offering of all. The police reports, focused on adult perpetrators, likely glossed over this most sensitive of subjects. The surviving children would have been placed with relatives or in state orphanages, their stories silenced by shame and fear, lost to history. Furthermore, was Mikhail truly the mastermind? The narrative constructed by the state and the press was of a single, dominant figure of evil. But cult dynamics are often more complex. Was there an inner circle that egged him on, that competed for his favor by suggesting ever more extreme acts? The role of women in the sect is particularly opaque. Were they passive victims, or were there key female acolytes who enforced Mikhail's will and perhaps even devised aspects of the rituals? History often overlooks the female accomplice, but her role can be pivotal. The location of the village itself has been lost to time. The state had reasons to suppress the exact location to prevent the site from becoming a pilgrimage destination for other fanatics, or to avoid bringing further infamy to the region. Today, researchers can only guess based on the jurisdictions of the police and court officials involved. The forest where these events transpired has likely reclaimed all traces. The wooden izbas have rotted away. The fields have been reforested. The physical memory of the place is gone. The case of Mikhail stands as a grim footnote in history, a story that feels both ancient and uncomfortably modern. It is a precursor to the 20th century horrors of Jonestown and the People's Temple, or the Om Shinriko cult in Japan. It demonstrates that the psychology of the destructive cult is not a product of modern times, but a recurring pattern in human history, emerging whenever hope is scarce, and the charismatic individual offers a deadly form of certainty.
The Tsarist state's response, while brutal, was also a failure of understanding. They saw only criminality and heresy, not the underlying social despair that made such a movement possible. Their solution, the hangman's noose and the Siberian mine, addressed the symptom, but not the disease. The poverty, the ignorance, the spiritual neglect of the countryside continued unabated, creating conditions where another Mikhail could potentially rise again. The legacy of Mikhail is a haunting reminder of the human capacity for evil in the name of good. It shows how easily spiritual yearning can be perverted into fanaticism, how charisma can be weaponized, and how isolation can make ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities. It is a case study in the banality of evil, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the rustic peasant sense, the horror that can fester in a remote wooden hut, fueled by poverty, faith, and the desperate human need to matter in a vast and uncaring universe.
The official story of Mikhail ends with the snap of a rope in a provincial town square. But for the historian and the true crime enthusiast, the case remains tantalizingly open, shrouded in the mists of time and bureaucratic obfuscation. The Tsarist police had their convictions. They had quelled a public menace and delivered a lesson in state power. But they had little interest in the deeper, more uncomfortable questions that the case raised. The greatest mystery is the scale of the atrocities. The police investigation was focused on securing enough evidence to hang Mikhail and his lieutenants. How thorough was their search of the vast forests surrounding the village? How many shallow, unmarked graves might have escaped their notice? The confessions spoke of multiple victims, but were these all that there were? Given the sect's existence over several years, it is terrifying to consider the possibility that the number of murders was higher than the official count. Were there travelers, pilgrims, or itinerant workers who vanished without a trace, their disappearance never connected to the fanatics in the forest? The origins of Mikhail's doctrine remain obscure. Was he a true isolated visionary, a man who constructed his horrific theology entirely from his own warped interpretation of the Bible and his environment? Or was he influenced by contact with other, even more secretive sects? Russia had a long history of extreme religious groups. The Skopsi, who practiced castration to achieve angelic purity, and the Klisti, who sought salvation through ecstatic dancing and self-flagellation, were known to have underground networks. Could Mikhail have encountered their teachings and taken their principles of bodily purification to a new, even more extreme conclusion? His rituals suggest a familiarity with archaic shamanic traditions that predated Christianity in the region. Was he tapping into a vein of knowledge that had been passed down in secret for generations? The fate of the sect's children is another dark area of speculation. Were they merely witnesses to the horrors, traumatized spectators, or were they forced to participate? In the extreme logic of doomsday cults, children are often seen as the purest vessels, and the sacrifice of a child is considered the most powerful offering of all. The police reports focused on adult perpetrators likely glossed over this most sensitive of subjects. The surviving children would have been placed with relatives or in state orphanages, their stories silenced by shame and fear, lost to history. Furthermore, was Mikhail truly the mastermind? The narrative constructed by the state and the press was of a single dominant figure of evil, but cult dynamics are often more complex. Was there an inner circle that egged him on, that competed for his favor by suggesting ever-extreme acts? The role of women in the sect is particularly opaque. Were they passive victims, or were there key female acolytes who enforced Mikhail's will and perhaps even devised aspects of the rituals? History often overlooks the female accomplice, but her role can be pivotal. The location of the village itself has been lost to time. The state had reasons to suppress the exact location, to prevent the site from becoming a pilgrimage destination for other fanatics or to avoid bringing further infamy to the region. Today, researchers can only guess based on the jurisdictions of the police and court officials involved. The forest where these events transpired has likely reclaimed all traces. The wooden izbas have rotten away, the fields have been reforested, the physical memory of the place is gone. The case of Mikhail stands as a grim footnote in history, a story that feels both ancient and uncomfortably modern. It is a precursor to the 20th century horrors of Jonestown and the People's Temple, or the Aum Shinrikyo cult in Japan. It demonstrates that the psychology of the destructive cult is not a product of modern times, but a recurring pattern in human history, emerging whenever hope is scarce and a charismatic individual offers a deadly form of certainty. The silence of the archive is deafening. The full truth of what happened in that remote village died with Mikhail and his followers on the gallows and in the Siberian wastes. All that remains are fragments, a few newspaper articles, a dry police summary, and a lasting sense of unease. The story serves as a permanent warning about the dark potential of faith, untethered from reason, compassion, or humanity.
It reminds us that the search for heaven can, with terrifying ease, create a hell on earth.